Hi, this is Misha, and we're kind of covering some of our older guns, and it's time for the Swedish Gustav M45, colloquially known in the USA as the Swedish K for Kulsprutepistol, machine pistol. Now, we did a very extensive video on the Finnish KP31 Suomi, also on the Finnish KP44, which was the copy done at Kpist of the Russian PPS 43. You might want to visit those first because they kind of inform this gun here. In 1937, Sweden would adopt in the military a version of the Suomi chambered for 9x20 Browning long, designating it as the M37, but soon they would switch over to a version in 9x19, so the same as the original KP31, known as the M3739. And it was this weapon they made the 50-round quad stack or coffin magazines for, that were later copied in Finland during World War II. So during World War II, Sweden used a version, an updated and slightly simplified and slightly smaller version of the KP31. And then they had some other domestic arms production, of course. They had their Mausers. They also made a version of the Lahti pistol, as the M40. And they had the very unique AG42, what we know today as the Ljungman, which was really an entirely Swedish design, and it gave them a very effective self-loading rifle during that war. Now, in 1944, they wanted a simpler, easier, lighter, more compact submachine gun to kind of replace the older M37, M39 series guns. They even looked at the KP44, at the time the M44, in development in Finland. In fact, Gustav gave some support to Kpist during the whole reverse engineering setting up for production process. In the end, though, they went with their own design here. In 1944, a Swedish inventor named Gunnar Johnson developed this gun at Gustav. It went into production in trials format. There was a competing design from Husqvarna, and both were put head to head the following year, so the last year of World War II or the first year of the peace. And not surprisingly, the Johnson Gustav design won and was designated as the Kpist or Kulsprutepistol M45, obviously being adopted in 1945. This is a really neat submachine gun. And it's not really revolutionary, but it took pretty much all the lessons learned from World War II and then added a post-war flair. Now, let's look at this. There are several influences. The major ones, though, of course, there is some Suomi elements we'll look at, but they're really in the details because they were trying to get away from the Generation 1 style gun of the Suomi to something cheaper. They saw the German MP38 and MP40. In fact, Sweden had a few hundred of those. The stamped steel construction, they liked that it was so much cheaper and faster to mass produce. It was reliable, it was lightweight, it could be made compact. They also saw the British Sten gun, which was really cheap to produce, but obviously wasn't near as elegant as the German design. Then America would come out with its own stamped submachine gun, the M3 grease gun, later the M3A1. And these so-called 10 Henry type guns were all the rage in World War II. And these guns were made without as many frills as was possible to still have an effective gun. Again, Russia had the PPS H41, which was simplified a good bit, but then they really went all out with the PPS 42 and PPS 43, making a very simple stamp receiver gun themselves. Well, by 1945, the war was over. Sweden was neutral anyway. They decided they could add a few more frills. So let's look what they did, and you can probably kind of guess where certain elements came from. Now let's start from the back this time. We have this very simple but effective folding stock. As you see, you can deploy it. Now, to fold it back, there is a catch here. You press and then it's very stiff, but it goes. But once it's folded, it just kind of isn't a detent there. You can just pull it out. It is made of tubular steel, not solid, so it's light, but since there are two tubes, it's well supported. It's just dimpled here for a butt plate. We do have this rubberized cover here to protect the cheek in cold, and of course also it would help in heat. It's not a very elegant stock, but it is very, very stable because of how it locks. It is paired with this very plain wood grip, just kind of like a 2x4. It has two panels. You can see the divider here. So a simple but effective stocking grip setup. The receiver tube is pretty well inspired by the Sten or the MP40. We have a two-piece style cap for disassembly here. You just press in and rotate this off and your bolt will come out. The original bolt was a single piece design, firing from the open position with a fixed firing pin. Very a la Sten, but it was made shorter. This tube is shorter than a Sten tube. The barrel has a jacket. It's actually just about 8 inches, same as the Sten. It's a heavy profile. It is removable, like on the Sten Mark II. There's a nut here. Let me go around here, guys. If I can press in. Yeah, stop there. So it has a knurled nut here with a spring-loaded catch at the bottom. You press this in, it unscrews, the shroud comes off, and your barrel's here, it pulls out. This is, on the nut end, kind of similar to what would later be used in the Uzi. The barrel itself is attached very much like on a Suomi, although it doesn't rotate out, it just pulls out, so it can also be very similar to the Sten gun. You see some influences there. Sights are simple, but a little more ornate than you would see in a World War II gun. I'm going to point this at you folks. We have a hooded front post, as you see. It is adjustable. Then we have a protected 3-position rear flip. The Swedish version of the Suomi also used a flip rear sight. So the sights are effective. They're simple, but not as simple as you might find on other submachine guns, showing the post-war. This was usually deemed good out to about 250 meters, being 9mm. As I said, it fires from an open bolt. We just have a standard charging handle here. It's checkered. Some are ribbed. There's a few different minor styles. On the original submachine gun, you could press this in to have the bolt locked to the receiver as a safety feature. Very good idea. Prevent runaway fires. We also have a more traditional J-hook safety back here, as you see. It's very common on submachine guns. So they had two safeties. The original gun fired full auto only. However, it had a slow cyclic rate, such as the grease gun or the PPS or the KP44, were as low as 550 to 650 rounds, depending on the exact ammo used. So it was very controllable. We have a large trigger guard for use with gloves. We have a large trigger for much the same reason. And we feed from very good magazines. So, sorry, the mag I happened to pull out, guy, wasn't one of mine. It was one out of a parts box. And it's very stiff in this gun. I think it has a lot of finish on it and Cosmoline. Sorry about that. The magwell is actually very interesting on these. They were originally made with an open-sided magwell, so it could take the coffin mags, the 50 rounders, This also meant it could take Suomi drums, although Sweden never manufactured them. But they were always working on this pattern of mag here. Adopted first in 1948, designed alongside, more or less. This is the trapezoidal mag, 36 round. The Swedish version does not have a lanyard loop. The Finnish version does, otherwise they're the same. This is a double stack, double feed mag, and as I talk about in my Suomi video, we have a lot of benefits to this mag. It's easier to load, it's more reliable, it's very fast and easy to mass produce. It fits this gun very tightly for some reason. But it took a few years to come along in Sweden and even more to come along in Finland. As I said in the Finn video, they did not adopt it till 1954. Once it was ready to go, they quickly abandoned the coffin mags, which were problematic and expensive to produce and hard to load. And they started issuing these removable mag wells with the original M45. There's this bracket that holds it in. This one does fit tight, so I'm just going to leave it in. Originally, this bracket was removable, so you could pull the mag well off. Later, they would actually rivet them in place when the 36 round was the standard and coffin mags were out. The mag weld is not strictly speaking necessary for function, but it does make mag insertion faster and easier, and it does give much more support to make sure the mag doesn't wiggle too much side to side or get struck and bent. It's a good idea. It's you know, just a little piece of sheet steel. Well, these were adopted. They started going to mass production a couple of years later, and they were very prevalent in the Swedish Army and Navy by the early 1950s. And they started to replace the older Suomis and some older bolt actions and handguns. Carbines, you know, the M94 carbine were sometimes replaced by the 1945 Gustav. In 1954, they adopted the B version, M45B. If you're familiar with Swedish guns, you know that's often the first update. And it just had a few changes. The original M45 had a gray phosphate finish. They found this could rust, especially in moist areas on the coast or on board ship. So they started applying a green finish, kind of a paint finish, over the gray phosphating underneath. And that way when it started to wear, they could just repaint them. And this gave much better protection from rust. They also went to a slightly different barrel shroud with smaller holes, just a little more durable because of the space between them being wider. They would strengthen the recoil buffer because they were shooting the 39B submachine gun ammo in these, which was pretty hot 9x19 parabellum. So they strengthened the buffer. Again, this is a pretty short receiver tube compared to its contemporaries, so it was coming back with some force. And they strengthened and improved the rear takedown. Little things. And this was the M45B. And it quickly replaced the original M45, and most original M45s that were already in service were updated to the new standard because the changes were pretty minor, but important. They would then introduce the M45C, which was the same as the B, but it had a bayonet lug on the shroud, so all the C was a different shroud. Interestingly, Robert RTG had some 45C shrouds in last year, but they were just a little too expensive for me to justify. Neat though. These would take the M94/14 bayonet, the Mauser short rifle, and they were mostly meant for guard duty and ceremonial stuff, so the gun would have a blade on the end. Pretty short lived variant. And then finally we have the M45D. And that's what this is here. The M45D introduced select fire. You see a selector switch here. As I said, the original gun was full auto only. Well, some military units and a lot of police units and a lot of export customers said, hey, we want to have single shot as an option. So they added a selector. The reason they originally went with full auto only was just to keep a very simplified trigger group But as time wore on, they realized there was a demand, so they offered the D. These would stay in mass production at Gustav until around 1964, and then in limited production thereafter. They would also refurbish these as time would go on, ultimately producing about 300,000, over 250,000 for sure. It was used a lot in Sweden, of course, but also was sold to export customers, and one of the most famous or infamous was the USA. Early in Vietnam, the Navy SEALs and some CIA operatives would pick up the M45, usually the D version, the select fire version, simply calling it the Swedish K, which was short for the Kulsprutepistol. However, in 1966, Sweden, the government said no, they don't want to get involved in East Asia. We're afraid our guns might be used in clandestine black ops. So they did an embargo. They cut America off from Swedish guns, which, to be fair, that's exactly what they were using these guns for, were special operations. They were used in black ops. They were even scrubbed, usually, of their markings because of reasons. So the Swedish K was very famous early on in Vietnam, and a good number made it over into country, but then they were cut off. This is where the whole Smith & Wesson Model 76 results. In 1967, Smith & Wesson began work on reverse engineering the K, and since it was a pretty simple, straightforward gun, they soon had them in production. But by the time the Smith & Wesson M76 submachine gun was available in the late 60s, Colt had started to deliver the XM177 in large numbers to the U.S. Army, and it really kind of supplanted it. Also later, other submachine guns such as the Uzi and even the Ingram MAC-10 to some extent would kind of take its place. So there really wasn't much need for the Smith & Wesson. Now, why the Navy SEALs liked the Swedish K, it was dependable, reliable, it worked well in the jungle. It also was over the beach ready. You could pull it straight out of the water and start shooting. It didn't have any water pockets that would make major issues. You could just let the immediate water drain out and you'd be good to go. And it was easily suppressed, especially compared to other guns of that day and time. Now, outside of Sweden, these were produced in a few areas, namely Egypt. If you know, Egypt would produce a version of the AG-42, the Jungmann, as the Hakim, and even a version as the Rashid. They would get the technology from Sweden around the same time as they would for these. They would also get the rights to produce the M45, designating it as the portrayed. These were the M45 or M45B version. They typically did not make the select fire. And they would start to produce these in the 60s and then run them for several years, keeping them for themselves. A lot of times Egyptian police would use them, and they would of course give them to Arab allies. We don't know how many portrayeds were made, but we know it was in the tens of thousands. So it's kind of interesting. The Smith & Wesson M76 machine gun, since they didn't have a lot of buyers on the US market as far as the military, they would turn to the police. And also in the 70s, you could still buy a machine gun. Of course, it had to be registered and all that, but the registry was still open, so some civilians bought them. Quality was pretty good, but not quite as good as the original Swedish by most all accounts. They would do a semi-auto version, the 760. It was an open bolt, but a semi-auto. This was again before they had all the stuff about open bolts. And then other manufacturers in the 80s would take over. MK Industries would make the MK76 and the MK76O. Another company, Global, would make a version. And then probably most famously to younger generations, Special Weapons would start making the M760 in the late 90s. And the Special Weapons guns are, like most special weapons, pretty hit or miss quality-wise, but you get the idea. By that point, Gustav was long out of production, although these did stay in the Swedish military. for quite a long time. They were in frontline use through the 70s and 80s, although they started to be replaced by the AK-5 when that was adopted, which was the Swedish FNC. And some were also replaced by the AK-4, which was a G3, but really the G3 was too big. This gun is still quite a bit lighter and smaller than a lot of the guns of the 70s. We're under 32 inches with the stock out, and about 22 with it folded up. Finally, in the 90s, after the end of the Cold War, they started to pull these out of service. Most units had given them up by the late 90s. And the Home Guard gave theirs up around 2003. And that was really about it. Some final reserves would give them up. But the Gustav was not officially declared obsolete until 2007. And then we started to see a large number of kits come over to the US, and that's where my weapon here. As with many of my semi-auto only guns, this was assembled by MK Gun Mods a few years ago for me. It is a closed bolt version. We'll look at inside here. This is one of the last ones he did, kind of his finalized design. Did I pull it? There we go. That would show inside. Here is that two-piece I was talking about. See that? It actually locks in. It's a pretty neat system. It's a little fiddly, but very secure. Then internally, here is the buffer we talked about. Boop. I'll get this out, guys. Here's our striker spring we had to add. Because this is a closed bolt, what you do is what they did on this one. Essentially, you would cut the bolt in half. This is the rear half, which normally would have locked open. This becomes your striker. And we still have our front with a floating firing pin. This is the original bolt. The safety in the handle doesn't work anymore. You can see that there because of the floating firing pin. But otherwise, we've pretty much kept a lot of the same functionality, including even pretty much using the same spring. Sorry, I call this the striker spring. This is actually the bolt spring. Oop. This is our striker spring, which is pretty much the original spring, just cut down to work as it should. So yeah, I just thought might enjoy seeing another semi-auto creation and talk about the history. See how that goes there, guys. Trying to put it together for the best I can for you. It's a little more difficult to get together when you're not inside the tube. But this is our system. And the original sear holds the striker back and makes a functioning gun. Now the selector switch is a dummy. We actually asked to let this be a safety, but the ATF nixed that. They wanted it out. So this is completely cut off and then just welded back on as a dummy selector. It actually has no function whatsoever. So the only real safety on this guy is the J-hook, but that's per ATF requirements. Otherwise, we just have a tube. This is a display barrel in here. The working barrel is the original 8-inch, but with an extension put on, and thanks to the removable system, it's not a big deal. Put in display when it's showing off, and the regular one when you want to go shoot. It's a very light gun. And this, like I said, is removable. It's just in there very tight for best work. Okay, stop there. Alright guys, got her back together. Sorry, there's not a lot to show on camera because you're going to need to put it vertical to get all the springs lined up properly, and this little cap goes on. Mechanically, I found it very neat how the cap works. The sling I've got on it is just a typical Xiaomi sling. A lot of times they just use the heavier leather sling from the Mausers and Lungmen, but it's awfully big and heavy for this gun, so I like to have this one on. Anyway, I just thought we'd talk about the history, show this semi-auto. I know I've shown this style in the past, but like I said, I don't think you've seen this individual gun because this is one of Mark's last that he built back when the parts kits were still coming in from What a Country and a few other sources. Now they're well dried up and going crazy. When I picked this up, not that many years ago, they were still 200, 250 bucks. So it was a fun little build. I like the Swedish history, I like the American history. And it's just a fun little gun that was pretty easy to make into a good, dependable semi-auto. And it's surprisingly soft recoiling. I guess the buffer has a lot to do with it. And the fact that it was designed for hot ammo, and typically we usually shoot 115 grain out of it. Anyway, if you're interested in other submachine guns and semi-auto conversions, we have several videos and a playlist. Also, we have several videos on Swedish history, so check those out. You can charge it with the stock folded, as you see. We really appreciate you tuning in. If you liked the video, please click like, and if you'd like to help support the channel, please click on the link and check out our Patreon page. This is Misha, and we'll see you next time.